The storm-battered research vessel lay twisted against the coral reef of North Sentinel Island, smoke rising from its shattered hull into the grey dawn sky. Dr. Sarah Chen dragged herself onto the pristine beach, saltwater burning her lungs as she collapsed onto sand that no outsider was supposed to touch. This was the Forbidden Island, home to the Sentinelese, the world's last isolated tribe who killed anyone who dared approach their shores. But as consciousness faded, she felt gentle hands lifting her. When she awoke in a bamboo shelter, a man sat beside her, his dark eyes filled with impossible recognition. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, he whispered in perfect English, his voice trembling. Then he reached for her face with shaking fingers, as if she were a ghost made real. Dr. Chen's blood ran cold. The Sentinelese didn't speak English. They had no contact with the outside world. So how did this man know her language, and why did his touch feel hauntingly familiar? What secret was hidden on this island that the world was never meant to discover? Sarah jerked away from his touch, her scientific mind racing through impossibilities. The man before her appeared to be in his 30s, his weathered skin bearing traditional scarification marks she recognized from her anthropological studies. His hair was long and dark, adorned with what looked like bird feathers and carved bone ornaments. Everything about his appearance screamed authentic Sentinelese, except for his words. "You're afraid," he said softly, withdrawing his hand. "I understand. But you're safe here. How?" Sarah's voice came out as a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "How do you speak English?" The man's expression darkened, as if her question had awakened painful memories. He glanced toward the shelter's entrance, where Sarah could hear distant voices speaking in what she assumed was the native Sentinelese language. When he looked back at her, his eyes held a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone who had supposedly lived in isolation his entire life. "My name is Kavi," he said, ignoring her question. "And you are Dr. Sarah Chen, marine biologist from the University of California, specializing in coral reef ecosystems in protected waters." "Where did you get that?" she whispered. Before Kavi could answer, voices outside the shelter grew louder. He quickly tucked the photograph away and pressed a finger to his lips. "The others don't know you're awake yet. Some want to handle you the traditional way." Sarah didn't need clarification. She'd read the reports of missionaries and fishermen who'd washed up on these shores, their bodies later found riddled with arrows. The Indian government had declared the island off-limits for good reason. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because I've been waiting for you." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. "I knew you would come." The rational part of Sarah's mind screamed that she was hallucinating, that she'd suffered a head injury in the crash and was experiencing some kind of elaborate delusion, but the bamboo walls felt real under her fingertips. The sound of waves against the shore was too detailed to be imagined, and the ache in her salt-crusted lungs was undeniably authentic. "I need to understand," she said firmly. "If you want my trust, I need answers." Kavi studied her for a long moment, as if weighing some internal decision. Finally, he moved to the shelter's entrance and spoke quietly in the local language to whoever was outside. Sarah heard footsteps moving away. "They're giving us time," he said, returning to sit across from her. "But not much. My influence here has limits." "Influence? I thought the Sentinelese lived as equals, without hierarchy." "There's much the outside world doesn't know about us." Kavi's smile was bitter. "Just as there's much we know about the outside world that we're not supposed to." Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a vast chasm, about to step into empty air. Every instinct told her that whatever Kavi was about to reveal would change everything she understood about this place, about these people, about the very nature of what it meant to be isolated in the modern world. The distant sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Time was running out, and Sarah realized that her survival might depend on understanding a truth that someone had apparently killed to keep buried. The rhythmic thrum of the research vessel's engine had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 3 weeks. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted the spectrometer one final time, watching the digital readout stabilize as it analyzed another water sample from the Bay of Bengal. The late afternoon sun cast dancing patterns across the lab equipment, and she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The data she'd collected would revolutionize understanding of coral bleaching patterns in these pristine waters. "Dr. Chen, we've got weather moving in fast." Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom, tension evident despite the static. "Satellite shows a squall line that wasn't there an hour ago." Sarah frowned, securing her samples in the refrigeration unit. Sudden weather changes weren't uncommon in these waters, but Rodriguez had 30 years of experience reading the ocean's moods. If he was concerned, she should be too. The vessel lurched suddenly, sending her stumbling against the lab bench. Through the porthole, she watched the horizon tilt at an impossible angle as waves that had been merely choppy moments before transformed into rolling walls of dark water. "All hands, secure everything that isn't bolted down." Rodriguez's voice boomed through the ship's speakers, no longer trying to mask his alarm. "This is going to get rough." Sarah's fingers flew over her equipment, shuttering the delicate instruments and lashing down anything that could become a projectile. The ship groaned around her, metal straining against forces that seemed to grow exponentially with each passing minute. Through the porthole, the sky had turned an ominous green-black, pregnant with violence. The first lightning strike illuminated the chaos outside in stark relief, waves towering above the vessel's superstructure, wind-whipped spray reducing visibility to mere yards. Sarah's radio crackled to life with fragments of distress calls from other vessels caught in the storm's sudden fury. Another massive wave crashed over the bow, and Sarah felt the sickening sensation of the ship sliding sideways down a wall of water. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems strained. She grabbed the intercom handset. "Rodriguez, how bad is it?" Static answered her for several seconds before his voice came through, strained and urgent. "GPS is going haywire. Navigation systems are showing impossible readings. We're being pushed toward..." The transmission cut to white noise. The ship shuddered violently, and Sarah heard the terrible sound of metal tearing. Through the storm's roar, she caught fragments of Rodriguez shouting orders to his crew, but his words were swallowed by another thunderous wave impact. She stumbled toward the bridge, using handholds to steady herself as the vessel pitched wildly. The corridor lights strobed erratically, and she could hear water rushing somewhere below decks. When she finally reached the bridge, the scene that greeted her was one of barely controlled chaos. Rodriguez stood braced against the wheel, his knuckles white as he fought to maintain some semblance of control. Charts were scattered across the floor, and two crew members worked frantically over a smoking navigation console. "The storm came out of nowhere," Rodriguez shouted over the din. "Instruments are reading magnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist. It's like we're sailing through a reality distortion field." Through the bridge windows, Sarah glimpsed something that made her breath catch. Rising from the churning water ahead was the dark silhouette of land, jagged cliffs and dense forest that definitely hadn't been there on any chart. "Where are we?" she called out. "That's impossible," Rodriguez muttered, consulting his instruments with growing desperation. "There's no land mass in this area. The charts show nothing but open water for 50 miles in every direction." Sarah gripped the chart table as another massive impact shook the vessel. Through the chaos, she caught glimpses of the approaching shore, pristine beaches backed by impenetrable jungle, no sign of human habitation. But there was something else, something that made her skin crawl with primitive unease. Along the treeline, she could swear she saw figures watching their approach. The ship's hull screamed in protest as it scraped against submerged rocks. Sarah felt the deck tilting at an increasingly steep angle as water rushed in below. Rodriguez was still fighting the wheel, but they both knew it was futile. The storm had them in its grip, driving them inexorably toward the mysterious shore. "Abandon ship," Rodriguez finally called out, his voice heavy with defeat. "All hands to the life rafts." But even as Sarah prepared to abandon everything she'd worked for, one thought echoed through her mind. According to every map, every satellite image, every navigation system in the world, the land rushing toward them simply did not exist. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose as Sarah's eyes fluttered open. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed, and the events of the previous day came flooding back like a tide of disbelief. The storm, the crash, the impossible rescue by someone who shouldn't exist on this forbidden island. She lay still on the woven mat, listening to the gentle rustle of palm fronds overhead and the distant crash of waves against the shore. The shelter around her was ingeniously constructed, flexible branches bent and tied with what appeared to be twisted plant fibers, covered with broad leaves that had kept her dry through the night. Despite her anthropological training, she felt like an intruder in a world that had remained unchanged for millennia. A soft footstep outside made her freeze. Through the gaps in the leaf walls she caught glimpses of movement, several figures passing by, their voices a melodic murmur in a language she'd never heard. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the gravity of her situation. She was among the Sentinelese, a people who had violently rejected outside contact for generations, who had killed fishermen and missionaries alike for merely approaching their shores. The shelter's entrance rustled, and her rescuer appeared. In daylight, she could see him more clearly. Tall for what she knew of Sentinelese physiology, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge. His skin bore the scars of a life lived in harmony with nature's challenges, and he moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his environment. He carried a carved wooden bowl filled with what looked like fruit and some kind of root vegetable. Setting it down beside her, he spoke in his native tongue, a series of clicks, soft consonants and flowing vowels that sounded almost like music. When she didn't respond, he gestured to the food and then to his mouth, the meaning clear. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her voice hoarse. She pointed to herself. "Sarah." He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then, to her complete shock, he replied in heavily accented but unmistakable English. "You are safe here, Dr. Chen." The words hit her like a physical blow. She scrambled backward, her scientific mind reeling. "How do you know English? How do you know my name?" His expression remained calm, but she caught a flicker of something, regret perhaps, in his eyes. "Eat first. You lost much strength in the water." "No, you don't understand." Sarah's voice rose, despite her efforts to stay calm. "Your people don't speak English. You've had no contact with the outside world. It's impossible." He sat down cross-legged, maintaining a respectful distance. Many things seem impossible until they are not. His syntax was careful, precise, as if each word was chosen with deliberation. "I am called Kael. It is not my birth name, but it is what I have become." Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about North Sentinel Island, about the isolated tribe that had remained untouched by modern civilization. The Indian government maintained a strict exclusion zone, protecting the Sentinelese from outside diseases and influences. No anthropologist had successfully studied them. No missionary had converted them. No government had conquered them. "You're not Sentinelese," she said, the realization dawning slowly. At least, not originally. Kael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have lived here for 15 years. This is my home. These are my people. But where did you come from? How did you get here?" Before he could answer, voices approached the shelter, several people speaking rapidly in the native tongue. Kael responded in the same language, his tone soothing but firm. Through the shelter wall, Sarah could see shadows moving, could feel the weight of curious and perhaps hostile attention. "They want to see you," Kael explained. "You are the first outsider to set foot on our shores and live. They are uncertain about what this means." "What do you mean, uncertain?" "There are those who believe you should be killed, as we have done with all others. There are some who think your survival of the storm means the ancestors wish you to live. and there are a few who wonder if your arrival signals something darker coming." Sarah's throat went dry. "And what do you believe?" Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I believe your arrival is not coincidence. The storm that brought you here was unusually severe, unusually sudden, and your research vessel—" He paused, meeting her eyes. "You were studying something specific in these waters, were you not? Something that brought you closer to our island than any scientist has come before." The accuracy of his observation sent chills down Sarah's spine. Her research into the unusual sonar readings, the strange electromagnetic signatures she'd been tracking. How could he possibly know about that? "Who are you really?" she whispered. The voices outside grew louder, more insistent. Kyle rose to his feet, his expression troubled. "That is a question with answers that may put us both in great danger." Sarah's eyes fluttered open to the sound of hushed voices speaking in a language that seemed to flow like water over stones. The melodic cadences rose and fell in patterns she couldn't decipher, punctuated by occasional clicks and soft whistles. Her body ached as consciousness returned, every muscle protesting against the coral cuts and bruises from the crash. She lay perfectly still, keeping her breathing steady while her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through what appeared to be woven palm fronds overhead. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and something else, herbs perhaps or medicinal plants. Through her peripheral vision, she could make out several figures seated in a circle nearby. The man who had pulled her from the wreckage sat among them, his distinctive scarring visible in the firelight. He gestured as he spoke, his voice carrying an authority that made the others lean forward attentively. Sarah noticed something odd about his speech pattern. While the others used the flowing, musical language she'd first heard, he occasionally switched to what sounded like fragments of different dialects, as if he were translating concepts that didn't exist in their native tongue. An elderly woman with intricate white scarification covering her arms raised her hand, speaking in sharp, questioning tones. The man, her rescuer, responded patiently, but Sarah caught something that made her breath catch. Hidden within his flowing response was a single English word, spoken so softly she almost missed it: scientist. When the group finally dispersed, her rescuer remained by the fire, staring into the flames. Sarah waited until she was certain they were alone before shifting slightly, letting out a soft groan to signal her awakening. He turned immediately, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied her face. Without speaking, he reached for a carved wooden bowl and brought it to her lips. The liquid inside tasted of coconut water mixed with something bitter, medicinal herbs, she realized. Her ethnobotany training kicked in automatically as she tried to identify the flavors, turmeric perhaps, and something that might be neem. "Thank you," she whispered. His hands stilled on the bowl, and for a moment she thought she saw recognition flicker across his features. But he simply helped her drink more of the mixture, then settled back on his heels, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. This time, there was no mistaking the understanding in his expression. For a long moment, they regarded each other in silence, the crackling fire the only sound between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. "Someone who chose to disappear," he said in perfect, unaccented English. The simple sentence shattered everything Sarah thought she knew about her situation. This wasn't first contact with an uncontacted tribe. This man wasn't a Sentinelese native who had somehow learned English phrases. He was something else entirely, an outsider like herself, someone who had chosen to live among the tribe, to become one of them. "How long have you been here?" she managed. "Long enough to forget why I ever wanted to leave." He fed another piece of driftwood to the fire, sparks dancing up into the darkness. "Long enough to know that your arrival puts everything at risk." The weight of his words settled over her. She wasn't just a castaway seeking rescue. She was a threat to whatever carefully balanced life he'd built here, to the tribe's isolation, to secrets he'd clearly worked hard to bury. "I never meant—" "I know." His voice was gentle but firm. "But intent doesn't matter now. You're here, and that changes everything." Outside their shelter, Sarah could hear the distant sound of waves against the shore, a reminder that somewhere beyond this forbidden island, her old life continued without her. The makeshift shelter felt smaller in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with the sound of gentle breathing and the distant crash of waves. Sarah lay awake on the woven mat, her mind racing despite her body's exhaustion. Every rustle of palm fronds overhead made her heart skip, wondering if this fragile peace would shatter with the sunrise. Kyle stirred beside her, his breathing changing from the rhythm of sleep to something more alert. She sensed him turn toward her in the darkness. "You're awake," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ocean's murmur. "Can't sleep," she admitted. "What happens now? When your people find me here?" She heard him shift, sitting up. In the faint starlight filtering through the shelter's gaps, she could make out his silhouette, broad shoulders tense, with what she was beginning to recognize as a familiar wariness. "That depends," he said finally. "On many things." Sarah sat up too, pulling her borrowed cloak closer. The night air carried the scent of salt and something else, smoke from distant fires. "There are others nearby, aren't there? I can smell the smoke." Cale was quiet for so long she wondered if he'd heard her. When he spoke, his voice carried an odd weight. "My people, they have rules, ancient laws about outsiders, about this island. Everything is assigned to my people, the wind, the tides, the way birds fly. A stranger washing up alive when so many others have died." He paused. "Some will see it as an omen. The question is whether they'll see it as good or ill." A new sound drifted through the night air, distant voices, barely perceptible but unmistakably human. Sarah's pulse quickened. "They're looking for me." "No," Kyle said, rising smoothly to his feet. "They're looking for me." The distinction sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She watched as he moved to the shelter's entrance, his movements fluid and silent. For someone who claimed to be from an isolated tribe, he moved with a precision that seemed almost military. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I know." His voice carried something that might have been regret, "and I'm sorry for that." The voices grew closer, and Sarah caught fragments of what sounded like a language unlike anything she'd heard before, not the Onge or Jarawa languages she'd studied, but something that seemed to flow like water, with underlying rhythms that felt almost musical. When Kyle returned to her side, his posture changed. Gone was the relaxed companion of the past day. This was someone preparing for conflict. "We have to go," he said, already gathering their few supplies. "Now, go where?" Sarah struggled to her feet, her injured leg protesting. "You said this island was your home. Parts of it are." His answer was cryptic, hurried, but not all parts are safe, not anymore. As they prepared to leave, Sarah caught sight of something that made her breath catch. In the faint starlight, as Kyle reached for his spear, she saw his forearm, and the unmistakable pale line of what looked like a surgical scar running from wrist to elbow. Her scientific training kicked in, analyzing what she was seeing. The scar was old but precise, made with modern surgical tools. No traditional tribal medicine could have produced such a clean, straight line. And now that she was looking more carefully, she noticed other things. His teeth were too straight, too white. His knowledge of her language was too perfect, lacking the accent she would expect from someone who had learned it as a second tongue. "You're not from here," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Kyle froze, his hand still on his spear. For a moment, the night seemed to hold its breath. "Sarah, you're not one of them, are you? The Sentinelese." Her voice was growing stronger, more certain. "You're like me, an outsider." The voices were closer now, and she could hear movement through the underbrush. Kyle's expression in the starlight was unreadable, but she saw him make some internal calculation. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm not. But that doesn't change the fact that right now I'm the only thing standing between you and people who have very good reasons to want you dead." He shouldered his pack and offered her his arm. "Trust me a little longer?" The morning sun filtered through the canopy as Sarah followed Kyle along a narrow path she hadn't noticed before. Her ankle throbbed with each step, but she pushed through the discomfort, too intrigued by his offer to show her something important to complain. The events of the previous day had left her with more questions than answers, and she sensed that whatever Kyle wanted to reveal might provide some clarity. They walked in comfortable silence, the sounds of the forest creating a natural symphony around them. Birds called from invisible perches above while insects hummed their constant chorus. Sarah found herself studying Kyle's movements, noting how he navigated the terrain with an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. Every step seemed calculated, every pause purposeful. After 20 minutes, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive banyan tree. Its aerial roots created natural alcoves and hiding spots throughout its sprawling base. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the tree itself, it was what lay partially concealed beneath it. Kyle's expression grew somber, something that shouldn't exist here, something that changes everything you think you know about this place. Sarah approached the structure cautiously, her scientific mind immediately beginning to catalogue details. The metal showed signs of advanced corrosion, but she could make out what looked like instrument panels beneath the vines. Concrete foundations suggested permanent installation rather than temporary shelter. This wasn't debris from a shipwreck or some natural formation. This was a deliberate construction. "How long has this been here?" she asked, running her fingers along what appeared to be a sealed door. "Since before I was born. My father showed it to me when I was 15, just as his father showed him." Kyle moved to a specific section of the structure and began clearing away vegetation with practiced efficiency. The elders call it the sleeping giant. They've been protecting its secret for 3 generations. Sarah's pulse quickened as Kyle revealed more of the structure. Faded markings became visible on the metal surface, symbols and numbers that made her breath catch. She recognized government identification codes, though weathered beyond easy reading. This wasn't some abandoned research station or forgotten military outpost. The level of sophistication suggested something far more significant. "Kyle, this is impossible. The historical records, all the documentation about this island, none of it mentions anything like this." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that sent a chill down her spine. "That's because the records lie. This island was never truly isolated, Sarah. Not in the way the world believes." She stared at him, trying to process his words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that my people haven't been living in complete isolation for centuries. We've been guardians, protectors of something that powerful people wanted hidden from the world." He gestured toward the structure. "This facility was built in the 1950s. The outsiders who came weren't trying to make contact or study us. They were hiding something here, something they believed would be safe under our protection." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Kyle was telling the truth, everything she knew about the Sentinelese people, everything the scientific community believed about their isolation, was built on a foundation of lies. But the hostility toward outsiders, the attacks on boats and helicopters, all part of the protection protocol, Kyle interrupted. "My grandfather worked with the original team that built this place. They needed the island to remain forbidden, untouchable. The reputation for violence served their purposes perfectly." Sarah felt dizzy, whether from her injuries or the revelation, she couldn't tell. "So your people aren't actually uncontacted?" "Not entirely, no. A select few have always maintained minimal contact with the outside world. We've had to maintain the deception and monitor threats to what's hidden here." Kyle's voice carried the weight of generations of secrets. "I was educated in that world, Sarah. I know your language, your technology, your scientific methods. I had to learn them to continue my family's role as guardians." The questions multiplied in Sarah's mind faster than she could voice them. What's inside this facility? What could be so important that it required this elaborate deception? Kyle moved to another section of the structure, revealing what appeared to be a sealed viewing window, its surface clouded with age but still partially transparent. "See for yourself." Sarah approached the window hesitantly, wiping away decades of accumulated grime with her sleeve. At first, she saw only darkness beyond the thick glass. But as her eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the shadows inside. Her scientific training helped her identify what she was seeing, but her rational mind refused to accept it. "That's not possible," she whispered. Kyle stood beside her, watching her reaction carefully. "Now you understand why this secret has been kept for so long, and why your presence here changes everything." The fever broke on the third day, leaving Sarah weak but lucid. She found herself alone in the hut, sunlight filtering through gaps in the woven walls, casting dancing patterns across her makeshift bed. Her body ached, but the sharp pain in her leg had dulled to a manageable throb. More importantly, her mind felt clear for the first time since the crash. She attempted to sit up, wincing as her injuries protested. The antiseptic scent she'd noticed before was stronger now, almost medicinal. Her bandages had been changed again, expertly wrapped with what appeared to be processed cloth, not the plant fibers she'd expected. The inconsistency nagged at her scientific mind. Kyle entered carrying a bowl of something that smelled surprisingly appetizing. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he were constantly calculating the impression he made. When he saw her sitting upright, relief flickered across his features. "You're better," he said in that strangely accented English that continued to puzzle her. "Thanks to you." Sarah studied his face as he set the bowl beside her. "How did you learn to treat injuries like this? And where did you get medical supplies on an isolated island?" Something shuddered in his expression. Traditional knowledge, passed down. Traditional knowledge doesn't include sterile bandages, and what I'm pretty sure is actual antibiotic ointment. She kept her voice gentle but persistent. "Kyle, I'm a scientist. I notice details. Nothing about your medical treatment follows traditional tribal medicine." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, she saw a war being fought behind his dark eyes. "There are things about this place you don't understand." "Then help me understand." Sarah reached out, her fingers barely brushing his wrist. "You saved my life. I'm not here to judge or exploit or harm anyone, but I need to know what's really happening." Kyle stood abruptly, pacing to the doorway. Through the opening, Sarah could see other members of the tribe going about their daily routines, fishing, weaving, tending fires. They looked exactly as she'd expected an uncontacted people to look, but Kyle seemed separate from them somehow, like an actor who'd stepped momentarily out of character. "My people have lived here for thousands of years," he said finally. "Unchanged, protected. Protected from what? From the outside world. From contamination, from becoming something they were never meant to be." His voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone his age. "But protection requires sacrifice. It requires watchers." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Watchers? People who understand both worlds, who can guard the boundaries." He turned back to her, and she saw resignation replacing the internal struggle. "I wasn't born here, Sarah. I came here 15 years ago." The admission hit her like a physical blow. "You're an outsider." "I was recruited, trained. There are others like me, scattered among the world's remaining uncontacted peoples. We maintain the illusion of isolation while ensuring their genuine protection." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The Indian government knows nothing. This operates above government level, international, well-funded, necessary. Kyle's voice grew firm. "These people deserve to exist unchanged. But true isolation is impossible in the modern world. So we create managed isolation. We? The Foundation. They've been protecting indigenous peoples for over a century. Quietly, efficiently." He sat back down, his shoulders sagging. "I never intended to tell you this. You were supposed to be evacuated before you recovered enough to ask questions. But something went wrong. The extraction team can't reach the island. Weather, initially, but now," he hesitated. "There are complications, political tensions in the region. Your disappearance has attracted attention we can't afford. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she knew. So what happens now? I don't know. The admission seemed to cost him. Protocol says you can't leave with this knowledge. But I can't. He stopped himself. I can't let them harm you. The quiet words carried a finality that made Sarah's blood chill. They would kill me to protect a secret? They've done it before. The Foundation's protection extends only to indigenous peoples, outsiders who threaten the mission. He met her eyes. I'm sorry. I should have let you die in the crash. It would have been kinder. Sarah stared at him, processing the terrible mathematics of her situation. She was trapped on an island that wasn't what it seemed, with a man who wasn't who he appeared to be, carrying knowledge that apparently made her expendable to people she'd never heard of. How long do we have? Maybe days, maybe weeks. They'll find a way eventually. Sarah nodded slowly, her scientific mind already working through possibilities. Then we'd better figure out how to change the equation. Kyle looked at her with something approaching admiration. You're not what I expected. Neither are you, she replied. Neither is any of this. But I didn't survive a plane crash and 3 days of fever just to give up now. The morning sun filtered through the canopy as Sarah sat cross-legged beside the central fire, watching Kyle demonstrate the intricate process of weaving fishing nets. His fingers moved with practiced precision, each knot a testament to generations of accumulated knowledge. Yet something about his technique seemed different from what the other islanders employed, more methodical, almost scientific in its approach. You count the spaces, Sarah observed, noting how he paused to measure each section. The others seemed to work more by feel. Kyle's hands stilled for a moment. Different teachers, he said simply, but his jaw tightened in a way that suggested layers beneath the surface. Around them, the village hummed with morning activity. Children chased each other between the huts, while women prepared food and men checked their hunting implements. The normalcy of it all struck Sarah as remarkable. Here was a community that had thrived in isolation, while the rest of the world transformed beyond recognition. Elder Naya approached, carrying a wooden bowl filled with what appeared to be medicinal herbs. She spoke to Kyle in rapid sentences, her tone urgent. Sarah caught fragments, words that sounded like warnings mixed with instructions. She wants me to check the boundary markers today, Kyle translated, though Sarah suspected there had been more to the conversation than that simple explanation. Boundary markers? Sacred stones that mark our territory. Sometimes storms shift them more. He paused, glancing toward the shoreline. Sometimes other things disturb them. The way he said it sent a chill through Sarah. Other things? Before Kyle could respond, a commotion erupted near the village edge. Shouts echoed through the settlement as several hunters burst into the clearing, their faces grim with concern. They surrounded Elder Naya, speaking in overlapping voices while gesturing frantically toward the eastern shore. Kyle shot to his feet, the fishing net forgotten. His entire demeanor shifted, becoming alert and focused in a way that reminded Sarah more of a military operative than a tribal fisherman. He listened intently to the rapid exchange, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, standing beside him. "Boats," he said tersely. 3 of them, anchored just beyond the reef. They arrived before dawn. Sarah's heart lurched. The implications hit her immediately. Outsiders approaching Sentinel Island was never good news. The tribe's isolation wasn't just traditional, it was protected by law. Any vessels in these waters were either lost, like she had been, or up to something far more sinister. "Coast Guard?" she asked hopefully. Kyle shook his head, his face grave. "Wrong type of boats. And they're maintaining distance, like they're studying the island." Elder Naya turned to Sarah, speaking directly to her for the first time since her arrival. The old woman's words carried an unmistakable note of accusation, and Sarah didn't need translation to understand the gist. "She thinks I led them here," Sarah said, more statement than question. "The timing is..." Suspicious, Kyle admitted reluctantly. Your vessel crashed 4 days ago, now this. The accusation stung because Sarah couldn't entirely dismiss it. Her research vessel had been equipped with emergency beacons and GPS transmitters. While she'd assumed the crash had disabled them, there was always a possibility that some signal had continued broadcasting, creating a trail for others to follow. I need to see them, she said. If they're searching for me, I can signal them to leave. The tribe doesn't deserve to have their isolation compromised because of my accident. Kyle studied her face intently, as if weighing her sincerity against some internal measure. It's not safe. If they see you alive on the island, then what? They'll know your people helped me instead of killing me? Sarah's voice carried an edge of frustration. That seems like something worth knowing. You don't understand the complexities, Kyle said. And again, Sarah caught that hint of knowledge that seemed to extend beyond what an isolated tribesman should possess. Elder Naya interrupted with another stream of urgent words, pointing toward the shoreline and then at Sarah. Her meaning became clear when several of the younger warriors began gathering spears and checking their bowstrings. They want to drive the boats away, Kyle explained. Show force to make them leave. That's exactly the wrong approach, Sarah said, her marine biology training extending to understanding the legal frameworks that protected indigenous peoples. Any sign of hostility could justify intervention. There are international laws, but they can be interpreted flexibly when people want access to something. Kyle's expression sharpened. Access to what? Sarah gestured around them. The untouched forest, the pristine waters, the complete absence of modern development. This, all of this. Undeveloped land, potential resources, research opportunities. Your isolation is your protection, but it's also what makes you valuable to the wrong people. The weight of unspoken truths hung between them as the village prepared for a confrontation that could shatter their world forever. The morning mist clung to the canopy like spirits reluctant to leave, and Sarah found herself walking alongside Kyle through paths that seemed to shift and breathe with ancient memory. 3 days had passed since her rescue, and each sunrise brought new mysteries that defied everything she thought she understood about this place. The others still watch me, she said, noting the dark eyes that followed from behind curtains of leaves and shadow. Kyle nodded, his weathered hands parting a wall of vines with practiced ease. They have reason to be cautious. Your arrival has stirred old fears. Sarah caught the weight in his voice, the careful way he chose his words. Since their first conversation, she'd sensed layers beneath his surface, knowledge held back, truths measured and rationed like precious water. His English was too perfect, his understanding of her world too complete for someone supposedly isolated since birth. Tell me about the fears, she pressed, stepping over a fallen log whose bark writhed with insects she couldn't name. He stopped walking. Around them, the forest hummed with invisible life, but Sarah felt the sudden stillness that came before revelation. Kyle turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, uncertainty flickered across his features. My people have a word, he said slowly. Thick Mora. It means the time of breaking, when the world splits between what was and what will be. Sarah's pulse quickened. And you think my arrival is connected to this? I know it is. His voice carried a gravity that made her stomach tighten. Because I have been waiting for you, Sarah Chen. Not you specifically, but someone like you. Someone who could bridge the gap between worlds. The admission hit her like cold water. How could you possibly know your name? Know about your research? Know that you've spent the last 3 years studying deep-sea thermal vents in the Indian Ocean? Kyle's smile held no warmth. Because I've been watching your work. All of it. Sarah stepped backward, her mind reeling. The implications crashed over her in waves. Satellite communications, internet access, surveillance capabilities that shouldn't exist on an island supposedly cut off from modern civilization. That's impossible, she whispered. But even as she spoke, pieces began falling into place. His knowledge of marine biology during their conversations, the way he'd understood her equipment without explanation, the subtle familiarity with concepts that should have been foreign to an isolated tribesman. 18 months ago, Kyle continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Your research team detected thermal anomalies in the Andaman Trench, patterns that didn't match any known geological activity. Sarah's throat constricted. Those readings had been classified, buried in preliminary reports that never made it to publication. How do you know about that? Because those anomalies weren't geological, Sarah. They were biological, and they've been growing stronger. The forest around them seemed to lean inward, as if the trees themselves were listening. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of reality. Everything she'd believed about this place, about these people, began to crumble. "Who are you?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Kyle ran a hand through his dark hair, and Sarah noticed for the first time the faint scar that ran along his hairline, too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be from childhood mishap. "I was born here," he said finally. "That much is true, but I didn't stay. 23 years ago, I left this island. I went to your world, learned your languages, studied your sciences. I became someone else entirely. Why? Because my grandmother had visions. She saw the time when the old boundaries would dissolve, when something sleeping in the deep places would wake. She saw that our people would need someone who could speak to both worlds when that time came." Sarah's legs felt unsteady. She reached for a nearby tree trunk, its rough bark grounding her in physical reality, while her mind struggled to process the implications. "The thermal readings are increasing. Every month, the patterns grow more complex, more purposeful." Kyle's eyes held a darkness that spoke of knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "Your research vessel didn't crash here by accident, Sarah. The magnetic anomalies that brought you down are connected to what's happening in the deep. And my people, the real reason they've remained isolated isn't just to preserve their way of life. Then why? They're guardians, keepers of something that was old when their ancestors first came to these waters, something that your thermal readings suggest is finally stirring after centuries of sleep." The weight of his words settled over her like a physical presence. Sarah found herself thinking of the strange dreams she'd been having since the crash, visions of vast shapes moving in abyssal depths, of lights that pulsed with alien intelligence, of songs that seemed to call from the deepest trenches of the ocean. "What exactly," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "are your people guarding?" Kyle met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of fears older than recorded history, something that should never be found. The morning brought with it a heavy silence that seemed to press against Sarah's chest. She had barely slept, her mind churning through Kyle's revelations like debris caught in a riptide. The tribe's origins, their true history, the careful deception maintained for generations. It all felt too enormous to process. She found Kyle sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where the first patrol boats of the day would soon appear. The rhythmic sound of waves against the shore provided a deceptive tranquility that belied the tension crackling between them. "You can't tell them," he said without looking at her. It wasn't a request. Sarah lowered herself onto the sand beside him, careful to maintain the distance that had somehow opened between them overnight. "You mean the authorities? The anthropologists who've been studying your people for decades? They think they understand us. They've built careers on their theories about isolation and primitive societies." His voice carried a bitter edge she'd never heard before. "If they knew the truth about what we really are, what we've preserved here." "What exactly have you preserved?" Sarah's scientific mind demanded specifics, even as her heart warned her she might not be ready for the answers. Kyle reached into a woven pouch at his side and withdrew something that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a device, no larger than her palm, made of a material that seemed to shift between metal and something else entirely. Symbols etched along its surface pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. "My grandfather called it a memory keeper," Kyle said, turning the object over in his hands. There are 12 of them hidden across the island. They contain records of before. Before what? Before the waters rose, before the great forgetting, before my people chose to hide rather than watch everything we'd built crumble into myth. Sarah stared at the device, her scientific training warring with the impossible implications of what she was seeing. Kyle, this technology, it's not from any civilization I know of. The materials alone shouldn't be possible with current understanding of... Your current understanding, he interrupted gently. But there was a time when we understood much more, when the islands that are now scattered across these seas were part of something greater, when my people weren't the last uncontacted tribe, but the last guardians of knowledge your world has forgotten. The sound of voices drifted from the village behind them. Sarah recognized the cadence of the tribal language she'd been learning, but underneath it she caught something else, words that sounded almost familiar, like echoes of languages she'd studied in her comparative linguistics courses. The children, she said suddenly. That's why some of them seem different. Why Asha picks up concepts so quickly. You're teaching them both versions of your history. Kyle nodded. The council debates constantly. Some believe we should maintain the deception indefinitely. Others think it's time to reveal ourselves, to share what we've preserved before it's lost forever. He looked at her directly for the first time that morning. Your arrival has forced that debate into the open. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. I never wanted to... As if summoned by his words, figures emerged from the tree line behind them. Sarah recognized several members of the tribal council, their faces painted with symbols she was beginning to realize held significance far beyond mere tradition. At their head walked Naya, the woman who had first tended to Sarah's injuries, her expression unreadable. They spoke in rapid, urgent tones with Kyle, their gestures toward Sarah making their topic of discussion clear. She caught fragments, words that sounded like warnings, like fear. The device in Kyle's hands pulsed brighter, as if responding to the tension in the air. What are they saying? Sarah asked when the group finally dispersed, leaving her alone with Kyle once more. A patrol boat was spotted before dawn, closer to shore than usual. They're conducting search patterns, looking for signs of you. His jaw tightened. And there's something else. Aisha is missing. Sarah's heart lurched. Missing? Since when? She didn't return to her family's shelter last night. Her mother thought she was with the other children, but... Kyle stood, scanning the beach and forest with trained eyes. She's been asking questions. About you, about the outside world. The kind of questions that make the council nervous. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. A curious child, caught between worlds, wandering an island full of deadly secrets. And somewhere out there, government boats closing in on their location, unaware that they were about to stumble onto something that would rewrite everything humanity thought it knew about its own history. We have to find her, Sarah said, already rising to her feet. Kyle's expression was grim. Before someone else does. The storm had passed, leaving the island draped in an eerie calm that felt more ominous than peaceful. Sarah sat cross-legged in Kyle's shelter, her notebook balanced on her knees as she tried to process everything he had revealed. The morning light filtering through the woven palm walls cast dancing shadows that seemed to mirror her turbulent thoughts. You've been watching us, she said, not looking up from her notes. Your people, I mean. How long? Kyle moved quietly around the small space, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. Longer than you might think. We've had to adapt, to understand the outside world well enough to protect ourselves from it. But the isolation, the hostility toward outsiders, that's all been carefully orchestrated? Not orchestrated. Necessary. He paused, holding a bundle of arrows. Sarah, what do you know about the Onge people of Little Andaman? The question caught her off guard. They were contacted by the Indian government decades ago. Their population declined rapidly after contact. Disease, cultural disruption, extinction, Kyle finished quietly. Not of their bodies, though many died. Extinction of who they were. Their children speak Hindi now, wear Western clothes, work in the tourism industry. The Anj culture exists only in museums and research papers. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She began to understand the weight of what Kyle was telling her, the impossible burden his people carried. "So you chose to remain hidden," she said. "We chose to survive." Kyle sat down across from her, his dark eyes intense. But it required sacrifices. Knowledge that could benefit the world, kept secret. Lives lived in careful isolation, and sometimes... He hesitated, seeming to wrestle with his words. Sometimes, what? Sometimes we've had to make harder choices. The fishermen who got too close to our shores and never returned, that wasn't just our warriors being protective. There have been researchers, journalists, missionaries over the years, people who discovered too much. Sarah's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that peaceful contact has happened before, Sarah. And those people made the same choice you'll have to make. Stay and become one of us, or..." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah found her hands trembling as she gripped her pen. "Or you kill them to protect your secret." Kyle's expression was pained but resolute. "We do what we must to ensure our survival. The world isn't ready for what we know. Maybe it never will be." A commotion outside interrupted them. Voices calling in the tribal language, urgent and excited. Kyle's head snapped up, his body tensing like a predator sensing danger. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Before he could answer, Ravi burst through the entrance, speaking rapidly to Kyle in their native tongue. The conversation was brief but intense, punctuated by gestures toward the beach. Sarah caught fragments, words that sounded like boat and many men. Kyle's face had gone pale. "The Indian Coast Guard," he told Sarah. 3 boats, heavily armed. They're performing a search pattern along our coastline. They're looking for me," Sarah realized. "When my research vessel was reported missing..." "Of course they are." Kyle was already moving, gathering weapons and supplies. "And if they find evidence that you made it to shore alive, they'll expand their search, land on the island. Everything we've worked to protect for generations will be exposed." Sarah felt the walls of the impossible choice closing in around her. Her rescue meant the destruction of an entire people's way of life. Her silence meant abandoning her own world, her career, her life as Dr. Sarah Chen, the marine biologist. "There might be another way," she said suddenly. "What if they found evidence that I didn't survive? Personal effects washed up on shore, maybe torn clothing, signs of a struggle with local wildlife." Kyle stopped packing and stared at her. "You would fake your own death?" "People disappear in the ocean all the time. If the search teams found enough evidence to conclude that I drowned or was killed by animals before reaching shore, they'd call off the search and leave your people alone. And you? What kind of life would that leave you?" Sarah looked around the simple shelter, thinking of the advanced technology hidden beneath the island's surface, the wealth of knowledge these people possessed. Maybe a different one than I planned, but not necessarily a worse one. Through the walls, they could hear the distant sound of boat engines growing closer. Kyle met her eyes, and she saw something she hadn't expected, hope mixed with deep admiration. "It would have to be convincing," he said. "And permanent. There could be no going back, no contact with your former life ever again." Sarah nodded, surprised by how certain she felt. "Then we better get started. How much time do we have?" Kyle listened to the approaching engines, his expression grim. Not enough. The morning brought with it a tension that seemed to permeate the very air around the village. Sarah woke to find Kyle already gone from their shared hut, and the usual sounds of daily life were muted, replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances cast toward the forest. She emerged to find elder Naya waiting for her, the old woman's weathered face etched with concern. "They come today," Naya said simply, her English stilted but clear. "The boat people. Kyle says you must choose." Sarah's heart lurched. Through the gaps in the canopy above, she could see a thin line of smoke on the horizon, a ship's exhaust trail. The outside world had finally come calling, just as Kyle had warned it would. But seeing it now, knowing that rescue was within reach, she felt unexpectedly torn. She found Kyle at the edge of the village, standing motionless as he watched the distant vessel through a gap in the trees. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and when he turned to face her, she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before: fear. "You told them where to find me," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "I activated your emergency beacon 3 days ago. I knew this moment would come eventually. I just hoped we'd have more time." "Time for what?" Instead of answering, he took her hand and led her deeper into the forest, to a place she'd never seen before. Hidden beneath a tangle of vines was a small cave, and inside, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, and maps, all clearly from the outside world. But these weren't random artifacts. They were systematic, organized, intentional. "My real name is Dr. Cale Morrison," he said quietly. "I'm an anthropologist from Oxford University. I came here 15 years ago as part of a covert research expedition." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're lying." "I wish I were." He pulled down one of the photographs, a university ID badge with his picture, clean-shaven and wearing a suit. "I was supposed to spend 6 months here, documenting their culture, their language, their way of life. Then I was supposed to leave and publish papers that would make my career. But you stayed." "I fell in love." His voice broke slightly. "Not just with Amara, though that came later. With all of this, with a way of life that exists nowhere else on Earth. And when I realized what my research would mean, the tourism, the cultural preservation projects, the slow death of everything authentic about this place, I couldn't do it." Sarah sank onto a rock, overwhelmed. "So you faked your death?" "A boating accident. Easy enough to stage in these waters. My team thought I drowned. The university held a memorial service." He laughed bitterly. "I watched the news coverage on a solar-powered tablet until the battery finally died 3 years ago." Through the cave entrance, they could hear the distant sound of boat engines growing closer. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The tribe, do they know? "Some do. The elders figured it out years ago, but they accepted me anyway. To them, I died as an outsider and was reborn as one of them. Amara, she knows I came from somewhere else, but not the details. She thinks I was shipwrecked like you. And now?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Now you have to decide whether to destroy us or save us." The boat engines were much louder now, close enough that Sarah could hear voices carrying across the water. Male voices, speaking English, discussing search patterns and landing zones. "If you go back," Kyle continued, "if you tell them what you've seen here, this place will never be the same. The scientific community will demand access. The government will want to study them. Well-meaning people will try to help them join the modern world, and within a generation, everything that makes them who they are will be gone." Sarah stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cave. "You can't ask me to make that choice. These people have the right to make their own decisions about contact with the outside world. Do they? When they don't understand what that contact really means, when they can't possibly comprehend the forces that would be unleashed?" Kyle's voice grew urgent. "I've spent 15 years here, Sarah. I've seen how perfectly balanced their world is, how complete. They have no crime, no poverty, no pollution. Their children grow up knowing exactly who they are and where they belong. How do I let that be destroyed?" The sound of boots on sand drifted through the forest. The rescue team had made landfall. Sarah looked at Kyle, this man who had saved her life, who had shown her wonders she'd never imagined, who had just revealed himself to be a living ghost. "There's something else," she said suddenly. "Something you need to know before I make any decisions." The voices were getting closer, calling her name. "I'm not the first scientist you've saved, am I?" The morning sun cast long shadows across the beach as Sarah followed Kyle through the mangrove thickets, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she'd learned. The tribe moved with practiced efficiency around them, dismantling their temporary camp with swift, purposeful movements. Every few minutes, someone would glance toward the horizon, scanning for signs of the outside world that threatened to intrude upon their sanctuary. The evacuation protocols were established decades ago, Kyle explained quietly as they walked. When my grandfather first realized that contact was inevitable, he began preparing contingency plans, sacred sites deeper in the interior, hidden caves, paths known only to the elders. Sarah watched a young mother secure her infant to her back with woven fiber, the baby's dark eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. "How many times have you had to do this?" "More often in recent years. Fishing boats that drift too close, helicopters that ignore the boundaries, thrill-seekers with kayaks thinking they can make history." Kyle's jaw tightened. "Each time we retreat further inland, losing pieces of ourselves." An elderly woman approached them, speaking rapidly in the island's language. Sarah recognized her as one of the elders who had been present during the ceremony. Her weathered hands gestured toward the jungle, then to Sarah, her tone urgent but not unkind. "She says the preparations are nearly complete," Kyle translated, "but she's concerned about you. The journey to the interior sites is difficult, and you're not accustomed to our ways of travel." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Tell her I can handle whatever's necessary. I won't slow anyone down." Kyle spoke to the elder, who studied Sarah with calculating eyes before nodding slowly. She said something else, shorter this time, and pressed a small object into Sarah's palm before walking away. "What did she say?" "That courage comes in many forms, and yours may be needed before this is over." Kyle glanced at the object in her hand, a carved piece of dark wood, smooth from handling, depicting intertwined waves. "That's a protection amulet. My grandmother made ones like it." A sharp whistle echoed from the forest edge, causing immediate stillness throughout the camp. Kyle's head snapped up, his body tensing. The whistle came again, 3 short bursts followed by 2 long ones. "Boats," he said grimly, "close enough to spot from the northern lookout." Chaos erupted around them, but it was ordered chaos, the result of generations of preparation. Children were gathered, supplies shouldered, tracks obscured. Sarah found herself swept along in the controlled urgency, following Kyle as he led a group toward a nearly invisible path that wound between massive tree roots. "Wait," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "Your research station, all the equipment, the years of work, will be destroyed," Kyle replied without breaking stride. "Everything that could reveal the truth about us." The implication hit her like a physical blow, including evidence of me being here. He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "Is that what you're worried about? Your reputation? Your career?" "No, that's not." Sarah struggled to find the words. "If they find no trace of me, if I just disappear, don't you understand what that means? They'll send more people, search parties, military vessels. They won't stop until they have answers." Around them, the tribe continued their exodus, but Sarah could see several people listening to their exchange, understanding the tone if not the words. Kyle's expression shifted as he processed her meaning. "You're saying you need to be found." "I'm saying we need to control how I'm found." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. What if there was evidence of a survivor who made it to another island, debris that suggested I was picked up by a passing vessel? The same elderly woman who had given her the amulet materialized beside them again, speaking rapidly to Kyle. His responses grew increasingly animated, and Sarah caught fragments of what sounded like an argument. Finally, the elder turned to Sarah directly, speaking in halting but clear English. "You would sacrifice yourself for our protection?" Sarah blinked in surprise. The woman's English was accented but precise, another secret hidden beneath the surface of this extraordinary place. "I would find a way to ensure your people remain safe," Sarah replied carefully, "even if it means giving up everything I came here to discover." The elder nodded slowly, then spoke again to Kyle in their language. Whatever she said caused his shoulders to sag slightly, and he looked at Sarah with something approaching admiration. "She says there may be another way," he said finally. But it would require you to trust us completely, and the risk—" Another whistle cut through the air, closer this time and more urgent. The elder barked orders that sent the remaining stragglers hurrying into the jungle paths. "Tell me what you need me to do," Sarah said, clutching the wooden amulet. Kyle met her eyes, and in that moment she saw not just the marine biologist she'd thought she knew, but someone shaped by generations of impossible choices. "Follow me," he said, "and prepare to disappear." The morning brought an uncomfortable silence between Sarah and Kyle as they prepared to leave the hidden chamber. The weight of his revelations pressed down on her like the humid air itself. She watched him carefully seal the entrance, his movements precise and practiced, and wondered how many other secrets lay buried in this island's depths. "The others will be worried," Kyle said, shouldering his pack. His voice carried a forced normalcy that fooled neither of them. "We should return before they send search parties." Sarah nodded, though her mind churned with questions she wasn't ready to voice. The anthropological implications of what she'd learned were staggering. Decades of academic understanding about isolated populations had been built on incomplete information that Kyle's people had deliberately obscured. They walked in relative quiet through the jungle paths, but Sarah noticed details she'd missed before: stone markers that seemed natural but bore subtle carved symbols, trees with bark stripped in patterns that looked like weather damage but formed a kind of navigation system. Even the seemingly random arrangement of fallen logs created a sophisticated early warning network. "How long?" she finally asked as they paused beside a stream. Kyle didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The deception began with my grandfather's grandfather, perhaps longer. The records in the chamber go back 7 generations. But why? What were you protecting yourselves from?" He cupped water in his hands, drinking slowly before answering. "At first, from disease, then from those who would study us like specimens, eventually from those who would exploit what we'd learned." His dark eyes met hers. "You've seen what knowledge of the outside world has allowed us to preserve. Imagine what certain people would do with our medical discoveries, our agricultural techniques, our understanding of sustainable living." Sarah felt a chill despite the tropical heat. "The healing compound you used on my wounds, it's not traditional medicine, is it? Traditional in that we've used it for generations, but refined through understanding of chemistry your people taught us inadvertently." Kyle stood, water dripping from his fingers. "We learned early that survival meant appearing primitive while secretly advancing." The sound of voices drifted through the trees ahead of them. Kyle immediately shifted, his posture changing subtly, his expression becoming more guarded. Sarah watched in fascination as he seemed to shed decades of accumulated knowledge, transforming back into the isolated islander she'd first met. "Remember," he murmured, "they trust you because I trust you, but they don't know what you now know." They emerged into the village clearing where several tribe members were gathered around Jira, who appeared to be recounting a story. The children sat cross-legged in the dirt, their eyes wide with wonder. To any observer, it would look like a scene from humanity's distant past. But Sarah now noticed the subtle signs of their hidden advancement, the way the adults' eyes tracked movement with tactical awareness, the seemingly random arrangement of huts that actually created optimal defensive positions, the children's games that were clearly teaching advanced mathematical concepts disguised as traditional play. Jira looked up as they approached, her weathered face creasing into a smile. She spoke rapidly in the tribal language, gesturing towards Sarah with obvious approval. The children giggled at something she said. "She's telling them you're a fast learner," Kyle translated, "that you show proper respect for the island's wisdom." One of the younger men approached, speaking earnestly to Kyle. Sarah caught fragments, her own name, words she recognized as relating to the sea and to outsiders. The man's expression was troubled. Kyle's face darkened as he listened. When the man finished, Kyle turned to Sarah with obvious concern. "There's been a development. My cousin was fishing in the deeper waters this morning. He saw boats on the horizon, multiple vessels, moving in search patterns. Sarah's heart sank. The rescue mission. More than that. He recognized one of the boats from previous encounters. Government vessel, probably military. And there's a civilian research ship with them. The implications hit her immediately. They're not just looking for me. Someone's using my disappearance as an excuse to approach the island. That's what we believe. Kyle's voice had taken on the flat tone of someone making difficult decisions. The question is whether this was planned or simply opportunistic. Sarah thought of Dr. Harrison, of his unusual interest in her research location, his insistence on satellite tracking. A sick feeling grew in her stomach. How long do we have? Hours, perhaps less. The weather has been keeping them at distance, but it's clearing. Around them, the village continued its peaceful rhythm, but Sarah could now see the underlying tension. Adults were subtly moving children toward specific locations. Tools were being gathered and concealed, defensive preparations disguised as normal daily activities. What happens now? She asked. Kyle looked toward the sea, though it wasn't visible through the jungle canopy. Now we discover whether you're truly one of us or still one of them. The archaeological chamber felt smaller with each passing hour, the weight of revelations pressing down like the earth above. Sarah traced the carved symbols on the wall with trembling fingers, each marking another piece of the impossible puzzle. The bioluminescent fungi cast shifting shadows that made the ancient artwork seem alive, telling stories that challenged every assumption she'd held about human civilization. Kyle sat cross-legged beside the central altar, his weathered hands moving methodically through a collection of artifacts Sarah hadn't noticed before. Crystal formations that hummed with barely audible frequencies, metal alloys that shouldn't exist, star charts carved in stone that depicted constellations invisible to the naked eye. My grandmother was the last keeper before me, he said quietly, not looking up from his work. She died when I was 17, but not before she taught me what our people truly are. We're not the isolated tribe the world believes us to be. We're guardians. Sarah's notebook lay forgotten in her lap. Guardians of what? Kyle lifted a spherical object from the collection, its surface reflecting light that seemed to come from within, of knowledge that was meant to stay hidden, of technologies that humanity proved it wasn't ready for. The sphere pulsed gently in his hands, and Sarah felt an odd tingling in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. She thought of her research vessel's instruments going haywire as they'd approached the island, the way her equipment had malfunctioned from the moment she'd arrived. The electromagnetic disturbances around the island, she breathed. It's not natural, is it? A barrier, Kyle confirmed, maintained by devices our ancestors placed in the deep caves. They keep most technology from functioning properly, discourage visitors, make the island appear more primitive than it is. Sarah's mind raced through implications. But my diving equipment worked. Some things function normally. The barriers are selective. They target complex electronics, communication systems, anything that could reveal our true nature to the outside world. Kyle's voice carried the weight of generations. For 500 years we've maintained the illusion. Let the world see us as they expect to see us. 500 years? Sarah leaned forward. That's impossibly specific. Kyle set down the sphere and met her eyes. Because that's when the last ship came. Not explorers or anthropologists, but others like us. Survivors from different sanctuaries around the world. They brought warnings of what was coming. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as Kyle stood and approached another section of the wall. With practiced movements, he pressed a sequence of symbols. The stone shifted silently, revealing a hidden alcove containing objects that made Sarah's breath catch. Books. Dozens of them, bound in material she couldn't identify, filled with text in multiple languages. Some she recognized: Sanskrit, ancient Greek, hieroglyphics. Others were completely alien, yet somehow familiar, as if her mind wanted to understand them. These are records, Kyle said, carefully withdrawing one of the volumes. From civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history, before the last great collapse. Sarah's scientific skepticism warred with the evidence before her eyes, the precision of the carvings, the sophistication of the technology, the carefully preserved knowledge. It all pointed towards something that shouldn't be possible. "How many?" she whispered. "Cycles? At least 7 that we have records of, perhaps more." Kyle opened the book, revealing pages that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Each time, humanity reaches a certain point of development. Each time, they make the same mistakes. And each time, a few survive to preserve what wisdom they can. The implications crashed over Sarah like a tsunami. The other tribes, the isolated communities around the world. Some, yes, though many are exactly what they appear to be. We're not the only guardians, but we are among the last. Kyle's expression grew grave. "Which is why your arrival changes everything." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber. "Because I know." "Because the barriers are failing." Kyle closed the book carefully. "The devices in the caves are ancient, powered by principles we understand but can't replicate. They're breaking down, and when they fail completely, the world will see this place as it truly is." "How long?" "Months, perhaps a year. The elders have been debating what to do. Some believe we should retreat deeper, find new ways to hide. Others think it's time to reveal ourselves, to try to guide humanity away from the precipice once again." Sarah looked around the chamber with new understanding. The weight of responsibility, of impossible choices, settled on her shoulders. "And you think I can help?" "I think you might be the bridge we need," Kyle said. "Someone from the outside world who can understand both sides. Someone who can help us decide whether humanity is ready for the truth or if we need to disappear entirely." The bioluminescent fungi pulsed in rhythm with Sarah's heartbeat as she grappled with the magnitude of what Kyle was asking. The fate of ancient wisdom, of technologies that could transform or destroy, rested in the hands of a marine biologist who had stumbled into something far beyond her expertise. The encrypted files scrolled across Sarah's laptop screen in her cramped government quarters, each document more damning than the last. 3 days had passed since their extraction from North Sentinel Island, and the debriefings felt endless. But tonight, alone with the thumb drive Kyle had pressed into her palm during those final moments on the beach, she finally understood the true scope of what they'd stumbled into. Project Archipelago. The name appeared in classified memos dating back 15 years, buried within appropriations for anthropological research and cultural preservation initiatives. Sarah's hands trembled as she read about systematic infiltration of isolated communities across the Pacific, each operation disguised as academic study while mining indigenous knowledge for pharmaceutical patents and territorial claims. The door to her quarters clicked open. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering, but it was only Marcus wheeling himself inside. His face looked haggard, the stress of their ordeal etched in new lines around his eyes. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, noting her laptop's glow in the darkened room. "Marcus, you need to see this." She turned the screen toward him, watching his expression shift from curiosity to horror as he absorbed the implications. Kyle wasn't lying. The whole program, it's been running for decades. We were never the first outsiders to reach the island. Marcus leaned forward, scanning the documents. "Jesus, Sarah, look at this budget allocation. Millions of dollars funneled through shell companies, all traced back to..." He squinted at the screen. "Meridian Pharmaceuticals?" The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard it whispered in academic circles, a biotech giant known for aggressive patent acquisition and questionable research practices. They've been using the research stations as cover operations. Every failed expedition, every tragic accident that kept people away from these islands, it was all orchestrated. A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes entered without waiting for permission, her expression unreadable in the blue laptop light. Sarah instinctively closed the screen, but Hayes raised a hand. "There's no point hiding it now, Dr. Chen. We know you have the files." Hayes moved closer, her voice carrying an edge Sarah had never heard before. "The question is what you plan to do with them." "You're part of this," Sarah said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "The research grant, the convenient equipment failures that stranded us there, you orchestrated everything." Hayes sighed, suddenly looking older than her 60 years. "Not orchestrated, salvaged. When your vessel went down, it presented an opportunity to finally make legitimate contact. I've spent my career watching Meridian's shadow operations destroy communities while claiming to study them. This was my chance to expose the truth. By using us as unwitting agents?" Marcus's voice carried barely controlled fury. "Sarah could have been killed." "Sarah was supposed to document the island's natural state and leave. I never anticipated." Hayes paused, studying Sarah's face. "You bonded with them, didn't you? With him." The memory of Kyle's hands teaching her to weave palm fronds, his patient translation of ancient stories, the way his eyes had lit up when she showed him her underwater footage, it all felt impossibly distant now. "He saved my life. Multiple times. And in return, I led you right to them. The Sentinelese have been under surveillance for years," Hayes said gently. "Kyle's presence there, his knowledge of the outside world, Meridian has been planning to exploit that connection. Your documentation gives us legal standing to intervene to protect them under international law." Sarah reopened the laptop, scrolling to a file labeled Phase 3 Implementation. The contents made her stomach lurch. Detailed plans for establishing a research cooperation with the island's inhabitants, complete with relocation proposals and resource extraction timelines. "They want to move them," she whispered. "The entire tribe. Relocate them to a cultural preservation facility on the mainland while they strip mine the island." Marcus grabbed the laptop, his face pale as he read. "This is genocide with a corporate letterhead." Hayes nodded grimly. "Meridian has been waiting for the right political moment. The new maritime territory agreements provide the legal framework they need. Without your documentation of peaceful contact, they would have simply claimed the island was uninhabited." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Now we fight," Hayes said. "Your footage, combined with these files, gives us evidence of both their cultural sophistication and Meridian's criminal conspiracy. But it has to be handled carefully. One wrong move, and we lose everything." Sarah thought of Kyle's final words to her, spoken in careful English as the rescue boat approached. "Remember us as we are, not as they will try to make us." At the time, she'd assumed he meant preserving their dignity in her research. Now she understood he'd been asking her to bear witness to their existence before it was irrevocably changed. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I didn't tell the debriefers." She pulled up her personal files, revealing hours of footage she'd kept hidden. "Kyle showed me things, ancient sites, sacred places. If Meridian gets their hands on this—" Hayes leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Then we make sure they never do." The emergency beacon crackled to life as Sarah's fingers found the activation switch. Red light pulsed against the cave walls, casting eerie shadows that danced like spirits around them. Kyle's hand shot out, covering hers with surprising gentleness despite the urgency in his eyes. "Once you activate that, there's no going back," he whispered. "They'll come for you, yes, but they'll also come for us." Sarah studied his face in the crimson glow. The man who had saved her from the wreckage, who had shown her wonders beyond imagination, who had revealed that his people possessed knowledge that could revolutionize everything humanity understood about marine ecosystems. The weight of that revelation still pressed against her chest like a physical force. "Your people have been protecting these waters for centuries," she said quietly. "The coral formations, the breeding patterns, the way the currents flow, it's all been carefully maintained, hasn't it?" Kyle nodded slowly. "My grandfather's grandfather spoke of a time when the great fish grew dark with sickness, when the coral turned white as bone. The elders learned to listen to the water's voice, to understand its needs. We became its guardians. The beacon's insistent pulse, seemed to echo Sarah's heartbeat. Through the cave entrance, she could hear the distant rumble of engines, search boats growing closer. Her rescue was imminent, but so was the exposure of everything Kyle's people had worked to preserve. "The pharmaceutical companies will come first," Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of certainty. "Then the marine research institutions. They'll want to study, to extract, to commodify everything your people have learned." "I know." Kyle's expression remained steady, but Sarah caught the tremor in his voice. "That's why I chose to trust you. Trust me." She stared at him, confusion clouding her thoughts. "The crash wasn't random, Sarah. We've been watching the research vessels that pass our waters for months. Most of them seek only to take samples, specimens, data to sell. But your mission logs, your research papers that we acquired, they spoke of conservation, of protection." The revelation hit her like a cold wave. "You've been monitoring our communications." "My brother Tan has always been gifted with the metal voices," Kyle said, gesturing toward the sophisticated radio equipment she'd noticed in their village. "We learned long ago that knowledge of the outside world is our only protection against it." The engine sounds grew louder, and Sarah could make out the beam of searchlights sweeping across the water beyond the cave. Her colleagues were close now, Dr. Martinez probably, leading the search with his typical determination. The thought of rescue should have filled her with relief, but instead, dread pooled in her stomach. "There has to be a way," she said, more to herself than to Kyle. "Some kind of protection, legal framework. Your laws have never protected us before." Kyle's voice carried the weight of generations. "Every time your world discovers something precious, it finds ways to justify taking it." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities: international maritime law, indigenous rights protections, conservation treaties. But she knew Kyle was right. The moment her research notes reached the outside world, this place would become a target. The unique symbiotic relationships she'd observed, the traditional knowledge that had maintained this ecosystem in perfect balance, it would all become intellectual property to be claimed, studied, and exploited. "What if," she began, then stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What if my research notes were lost in the crash?" Kyle's eyes widened slightly. "Sarah, what if the only survivor's account mentioned a brief contact with indigenous people who provided basic assistance before disappearing? What if the unique marine phenomena I observed were attributed to uncharted volcanic activity or unusual currents?" The searchlight beam swept past their cave entrance, and voices carried across the water, her name being called through megaphones. Sarah felt the pull of her old life, her career, her carefully constructed identity as a respected marine biologist. But she also felt something else, a responsibility that transcended professional ambition. "You would sacrifice your discovery?" Kyle asked. "Your career advancement?" "Discovery," Sarah almost laughed. "Your people have known these things for centuries. I'd just be forgetting to steal them." A boat engine cut to idle just outside the cave, and she heard Martinez's voice clearly now. "Sarah, Sarah, if you're in there, signal us." Kyle reached into his waterproof pouch and withdrew Sarah's research tablet, somehow salvaged from the wreck and carefully preserved. Without a word, he held it out to her. Sarah took the device, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. Years of work, groundbreaking observations, career-defining data, all there in digital form. Her finger hovered over the deletion command. "Whatever you choose," Kyle said softly, "know that you'll always have a place among the guardians of these waters." The searchlight beam found their cave entrance, blazing white and insistent, while Sarah held her future in trembling hands. The helicopter's rotors sliced through the morning air as Sarah watched North Sentinel Island shrink beneath them. Her fingers traced the small carved shell pendant Kyle had pressed into her hands during their final moments together, a token of their impossible friendship and the secret that would forever change how the world understood isolation. Dr. Martinez sat across from her, his weathered face etched with concern. "The debriefing will be intensive," he warned over the engine noise. The Indian authorities, the UN Indigenous Rights Commission, even the press. Everyone wants to know what happened out there. Sarah nodded, clutching the pendant tighter. How could she explain that Kyle wasn't just a Sentinelese tribesman, but a former anthropologist who'd chosen exile over civilization 20 years ago? That his fluent English came from a PhD at Cambridge, not some miraculous language acquisition? That the uncontacted tribe had been carefully managing their isolation with the guidance of someone who understood both worlds intimately? The mainland coast of Port Blair emerged through the haze, bustling with activity that seemed surreal after weeks in the timeless rhythm of island life. Sarah's mind raced through the story she'd have to tell, carefully edited, protecting both Kyle's identity and the tribe's sovereignty. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said, leaning forward. "Your research data from before the crash, the acoustic mapping project. The preliminary results are extraordinary. Those underwater formations you discovered could revolutionize our understanding of prehistoric sea levels." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Her scientific discovery felt insignificant compared to what she'd learned about human resilience, about choosing one's own path regardless of society's expectations. Kyle had shown her that sometimes the greatest courage lay in walking away from everything familiar. The helicopter touched down at the Port Blair Administrative Complex, where a crowd of officials waited. Sarah straightened her borrowed clothes, simple garments the tribal women had woven for her departure, and prepared to face questions she could only partially answer. The debriefing room was sterile and intimidating, filled with men in crisp uniforms and serious expressions. For 3 hours, they grilled her about every detail: the crash, her initial contact, the tribe's behavior, their technology level, their apparent immunity to outside diseases. "You're certain they showed no signs of previous contact with outsiders?" asked a UN representative, his pen poised over official documents. "None whatsoever," Sarah replied smoothly, remembering Kyle's careful coaching on this very question. "They were curious but cautious. Their leader," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "seemed to understand that I meant no harm. And the language barrier? How did you communicate?" "Gestures, mostly. Simple drawings, universal human expressions. Each lie came easier than the last, though it felt like betraying the profound conversations she'd shared with Kyle about philosophy, science, and the price of progress." Hours later, Sarah finally escaped to her hotel room overlooking the harbor. The bed felt impossibly soft after weeks on woven mats, the electric lights harsh after firelight and starshine. She opened her laptop for the first time since the crash and stared at the screen full of emails, conference invitations, and interview requests. Her phone buzzed with a text from her research partner in Mumbai. "Sarah, thank God you're safe. The whole scientific community is buzzing about your survival story. Nature wants an exclusive about first contact protocols. This could make your career." Career. The word felt foreign now. Sarah walked to the window and gazed out at the dark ocean, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, Kyle was likely sitting by the shore, watching the same stars and contemplating the burden of his chosen exile. She pulled out her laptop and began typing her official report, crafting each sentence to protect the truth while satisfying bureaucratic curiosity. But alongside the official document, she started another file, a private journal of her real experiences, Kyle's incredible story, and the profound questions their friendship had raised about civilization, progress, and the right to be left alone. The Sentinelese weren't just the world's last uncontacted people. They were a conscious choice made by individuals who valued autonomy over advancement, and Kyle was their guardian, using his knowledge of both worlds to help them maintain that choice. 3 days later, as Sarah boarded a flight back to her university, she carried 2 stories. The official version would satisfy the authorities and protect the island's continued isolation. The private truth would remain locked in her heart, a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries couldn't be published in journals or shared with colleagues. The plane lifted off, carrying her back to a world of conferences and research grants, peer reviews and academic politics. But part of her would always remain on that forbidden island, where she'd learned that true wisdom sometimes meant choosing what to preserve over what to explore. Below the clouds, North Sentinel Island kept its secrets, guarded by a man who'd found his purpose in protecting the choice to remain apart from a world that demanded connection.